All right, let's go ahead and open our Bibles up to 1 Samuel chapter 25. We're going to we're going to try to, the remaining part of this chapter, we're going to divide into two sections. We're going to look at one section tonight, which is 18 through 31. And I've entitled this section, Abigail to the Rescue. And we're going to talk more about why that's entitled the way it is, obviously, tonight. But we're going to talk about the final section next week. So I've been one of the things that I'll just say, one of the things that that some of my teachers in school noted as I was going through the program down there in Florida. You know, you always want to try to figure out things that you can get better at. As you know, any time that you do public speaking, obviously you think about the art of speaking and things of that nature. But one of the things that I was taught to a lot about was trying to focus a lot more on the application, because sometimes I focus a lot on detail, and you know, sometimes the detail is important. I think it is, but the application sort of sticks with us a little bit more. So one thing that I've thought about doing is that before we begin class, talk about a couple of points of application to think about before we read through this text. And they're just two simple things that I think are highlighted that we can take application from chapter 25, verses 18 through 31. Two things that I want you to think about as we're looking at this section tonight. First, sort of as Brother Wayne prayed just a moment in his prayer, but a lot of times in society, one of society's greatest needs is for people that are peacemakers. And Brother Wayne alluded to that tonight. If you've been watching the news this past week, you know that Palestine and Israel, right? You've seen constant fighting going on between those two nations. And, you know, one of the greatest needs that we have in society are people that make peace. Because people don't always get along, right? We know that problems arise between people. People get in arguments, whether that's, you know, violent, like what you see going on in the Middle East. May not always be the case, but we understand that people don't always get along. You know, and as we think about this tonight, you know, even when one side might have a right to be angry, just like David does have a right to be angry, sometimes the immediate need to get retribution does a lot more damage in the long run than what we might think about, right? Even though David's a very good man, we're going to point out that if he followed through with his immediate need to get revenge on Nabal, it would have done a lot of long-term damage for him. And something to think about is that, you know, sometimes if we found ourselves in an argument with other people, somebody does something wrong to us, that we feel that immediate need to get revenge. Well, sometimes if we've followed through and we've acted on that, we do a lot of damage to ourselves in the long run. We're going to see how Abigail basically saves David from that. And I'll say something about how we entitle this, but when we talk about Abigail to the rescue, not only is she going to rescue her household from David's wrath, but she's also going to save David from himself. And we'll talk about that towards the end of Bible class tonight. You know, when you think about peacemaking, one of the ways that I thought about, you know, something that we could think about moving forward, you know, I think about social media a lot, because social media has its benefits. There are certainly some negatives to it, and I think one of the negatives sometimes that is associated with social media is the fact that if somebody says something that I don't like, I can immediately respond back to them, and I don't think about what I say. And, you know, maybe I'm in the right, but if I don't word it, or if I don't handle the situation appropriately, you know, I can cause a permanent division or a permanent argument between somebody, and it hurts my, you know, connection with that individual. So sometimes we feel the need to get immediate satisfaction when somebody does something that we don't like, and I think social media is a great aspect of that. I think you can, if you're on Facebook and things like that, you can see people that sometimes need to hold their peace before engaging with arguments and things like that. But, you know, one of the things in the New Testament we want to think about is that part of the core identity of a Christian is the ability to make peace. You know, when Jesus talked about the attributes that are part, what we call the Beatitudes, but the attributes that are a part of those that are in the kingdom of God, he said, blessed are the peacemakers for what? How does the end of that verse finish? Blessed are the peacemakers for they shall be called the children of God. Now, that's pretty interesting how that's attributed. If you look at the Beatitudes, it's the only saying that ends with, for they shall be called the children of God. You think about who says that. It's Jesus, right? It's the Son of God. And you think about what Jesus' main purpose on earth was really to make peace, right? To make peace between man and God. Ephesians 2:17 through 20, Paul said that he preached peace, or that peace was preached to those that were both afar off and to those that were near, talking about Jew and Gentile, and so that they were reconciled together in one body. Jesus' sole mission was to make peace between God and man, and so naturally, it's interesting to note that since that was his central purpose, he says that part of being a Christian, being a child of God, the central component is to make peace with people. Something else to think about as well. You think about a person's character. A person's character is really defined by what they do and not what people say about them or not what people attribute to them. And we've alluded to this before, but we know that Nabal is a prominent individual in this area. He's from the house of Caleb. He came from a great family, and people would think you came from a great family, it means you got to be a great person. Well, that's not always the case. On the other hand, Abigail, she's not the head of the household. And certainly we understand why that was the case. Abigail was not the head of the household, but unlike Nabal, she's going to show a greater awareness for her house than Nabal did. Because, as we see, a person's actions define their character. And that's what separates Nabal and Abigail, their actions in response to David. And we're going to take that thought next week and talk about how this distinguishes David and Saul from one another. So that's a couple of things to think about. We're going to note some things about, how do we become better peacemakers as we look at what Abigail does in verses 18 through 31 this evening. So let's begin looking at verse 18. Right, so we know where we're at this point, right? David has told his men, get your swords ready. He's got his sword ready. He's about to be on his way to go meet Nabal. And we'll learn more about his motives tonight. Where we left off was Nabal's servant, who disagreed with Nabal, telling Abigail what had happened. And so we pick up now where Abigail begins to act. Let's look at first at verse 18. Well, verse 18 and 19. Then Abigail made haste and took 200 loaves and 2 bottles of wine and 5 measures of parched corn and 100 clusters of raisins and 200 cakes of figs and laid them on donkeys. She said unto her servants, go on before me. Behold, I come after you. But she told not her husband Nabal. Now note, of course, that she does not go to meet David empty-handed. Right? We remember why this situation, this problem where you've got animosity here, it all began because, Nabal didn't show gratitude towards what David did and help provide for his men. And so, she, of course, notes that this was the central problem here, the core issue. As a result, that she takes provisions here. And we'll just simply say here that these provisions would have been pretty sufficient to feed about 600 men. Whereas we talked about David, this being a time of a feast, David and his men sort of basically wanting what's left. Well, the idea here is that Abigail, took of the main goods to help deliver to David and to provide for his men. Now, you note in verse 19, though, she doesn't take her husband with her, right? And you think about the idea of peacemaking. Sometimes you've seen people that are trying to settle a problem between two individuals, and it seems like they make the problem worse. And sometimes that can happen because maybe one individual is partial to a side, so that they don't they don't see that some of the issues that one side has. And that keeps them from being partial or being reasonable in this situation. Now, you note that Abigail's not going to go to David and start defending her husband as David did all of the wrong, because, again, part of Abigail's character is that she assessed her own husband, she assessed the character of David and acted accordingly. Now, you note again that she doesn't take her husband at all. Now, you think about sometimes whenever you have to handle an argument between two individuals, sometimes it's best to sort of separate them and to try to talk to them one-on-one. Because, if you get two people that hate each other, that don't agree about something in the same room, a lot of times that's going to spill over and people are going to start arguing. And it doesn't solve the issue. And we're going to, as we saw back in verse 17, Nabal's not the type of person that you can reason with. He's a foolish, he's a worthless individual. And so basically Abigail is going to go and talk to David alone, in a sense, to try to solve this problem. We could say here that, in this situation, Abigail's basically going to talk to the grown-up in the problem, right? We could say, Nabal's not a very good person. He's not a very mature person. And, sometimes when you have a dispute between two people, sometimes you have to go and reason with a grown-up and say, sort of temper it down, because the grown-up in the situation is going to listen, right? And is going to, see the bigger picture. Nabal's not the type of individual at all that would see the bigger picture of rejecting David, but Abigail understands that David's sort of the bigger person here. But again, you note that she takes all of these provisions, right? She figures out what the core problem is and she works at it, right? She doesn't irrationally defend her husband. So you note again, verse 19, her servants go before her. And this is simply like a response to what David did to Nabal, right? David sent his servants to Nabal to address him. Now, one thing I just will say, an interesting point here. If you've got the King James Version, verse 18 talks about that Abigail sent 5 measures of parched corn. This is something that I didn't know till recently, but corn did not grow in the Middle East at this time. The corn that we think about did not, the corn on the cob, kernels of corn, didn't grow in the Middle East at this time. The word corn is actually just a reference to grain, typically wheat grain. But that's something to think about anytime you see the word corn in the King James Version. Generally, it's referring to wheat, and not corn like we think about in the United States. So, right, unlike Nabal, who doesn't care about what David's request was, Abigail is going to act and to try to basically work as the intercessor between David and Nabal, to be the peacemaker. And you see that because she's willing to address the main issue, sending provisions for David and his men. Now, verses 20 through 22, we get a little bit more insight into what David's thoughts are concerning this situation. Now, verse 20, what verse 20 is going to indicate to us is that the timing of David and Abigail meeting was almost timed perfectly, we could say. Verse 20, and it was so as she rode on the donkey that she came down by the covert of the hill, and behold, David and his men came down against her, and she met them. Now, I want to read to you the way the ESV has this translated, which gets a little bit more, it puts a little bit more familiar terms for us. The ESV says, and as she rode on the donkey and came down under the cover of the mountain, behold, David and his men came toward her, and she met them. So the picture is, the idea is that they basically meet up at the opportune moment, is the indication here. You sort of get this by looking at the imagery that's sort of described here. You have the picture of basically, right, she and her servants, they came down by the covert of the hill, or came down the hill. So you can think about, if you try to think about it, you've got Abigail, her servants, they're on this hill. David, his men are on this hill. And the picture is they're both descending down. They meet in the middle, in between the two mountains. And so the picture here is that it's the timing of this is perfect. The timing of this is perfect, where she meets David, which plays a role going forward. It shows that we'll see this in a moment, but it shows that the providence of God was at work here. Now, it's good that the providence of God was at work because of David's thoughts, verses 21 through 22. Now David had said, "Surely in vain have I kept all that the fellow hath in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that pertained unto him. And he hath repaid me evil for good. So and more also do God unto the enemies of David, if I leave of all that pertain to him by the morning light, any that pisseth against the wall." It's a reference to any male, basically. So you want to note verse 21. That verse begins, "Now David had said." So what we understand is that what David says here actually happened before they left. So David and his men, they girded up their sword. David basically told his men what they were going to do. And that's verses 21 through 22. They've left, and we're now caught up in the present with David meeting Abigail. But let's look at some of the things that David notes here. Right, David's basic gripe and complaint, verse 21, is, "I've kept," and he includes his men in that, right? "I have kept all that this fellow hath in the wilderness. I've protected it. Nothing was missing that was belonged to him." And again, as we noted, David did all of this without requiring compensation. Right? He did all of this without being incentivized to do it. And David basically says, verse 21, "We helped Nabal out, but Nabal has not helped us out." And he takes this as a great complaint. And this is something that we note, right? It's in this situation, it's natural to be angry, right? We could say David has a right to be angry because he did something out of kindness to Nabal. Nabal has shown him great disrespect. David has a right to be angry in this situation. But David's solution, verse 22, is, let's get revenge. Again, "So and more also do God unto the enemies of David, if I leave of all that pertain to him by the morning light any male." Now you want to note here what the extent of revenge is. What the extent of revenge is. It's not just killing Nabal, right? Verse 22, it's not just killing Nabal. "If I leave of all that pertain to him by the morning light any male." David's intent here, again, not just to kill Nabal, but David's intent is to kill any male individual that was a servant to Nabal, a son to Nabal, any male connected to Nabal's household. David told his men they were going to kill them. Now, you keep in mind that, as we said, only Nabal's been guilty, right, of showing disrespect to David. Nabal's servant, we saw that Nabal's servant did not agree with Nabal at all. And Nabal's servant was on David's side, but yet David is consumed with his anger that his response is, well, if he's a servant of Nabal, he must agree with Nabal. He's got to be on Nabal's side. He's worthy to be killed as well. And we have to keep that in mind, right? David doesn't have the full picture here. Abigail's going to help him see that. This is important because we remember what happened a couple of chapters earlier to the priest in the city of Nob, right? They were accused of helping David out. Saul did not take into consideration anything concerning the fact that, David said that he was on the king's business. Saul didn't take that into consideration. He just knew that they helped David out. And Saul's response was, I'm going to kill every individual, not just the men, but also the priests, their families, and their children, because they helped David out. Right? And we talked about how that painted Saul as this villain compared to David, who's basically the hero at this point in the book of 1 Samuel. But here is David doing something that's almost like what Saul did earlier, that he was that we obviously look down upon. David's willing to take innocent life as a means to get revenge, just as Saul did a couple of chapters earlier. But we keep in mind that theme that keeps appearing over and over again in the book of 1 Samuel, and that's that God was on David's side, whereas he was not on Saul's side. And you see that come to pass in this section because you don't really see anyone step up to appease Saul's wrath there in Nob. But as we're going to note, God provides Abigail as basically the voice of reason here to keep him from doing something that he would later on regret. Now you also keep in mind verse 22, this same question we've talked about before, right? Who has the right to take vengeance? And that's important because in verse 22, the wording of this is a little bit different than the way we would talk today. So and more also do God unto the enemies of David, if I leave of all, and again, if I leave any male alive. But here David is noting himself with the actions of God. Or in other words, David sees himself as the tool of getting revenge. Or you know how we talked about how God takes vengeance, right? Vengeance belongs to God. David sees himself as God's instrument for vengeance against Nabal. Right? That's David's mindset here, which is very different from chapter 24 where he told Saul, I'm going to let God handle the matter. But here in chapter 25, David's of the mindset that I am God's tool to get vengeance and I'm going to get it. But Abigail is going to remind him as we go forward who has the right to take vengeance. All right, so now we come down to verse 23, and Abigail and David meet. Verse 23, Abigail saw David. She hurried and lighted off the donkey and fell before David on her face and bowed herself to the ground. And so, again, you know that again, this is a way of showing respect. Here's a good point to think about. If you try to make peace between two individuals, you need to show respect for the side that possibly you may not agree with. It doesn't mean that you have to completely agree with them, but in this case, Abigail does agree with David. But you want to show respect to the individuals when you're trying to appease their wrath, and that's what Abigail first does. She treats David with respect. Now verses 24 through 25. Abigail's going to take responsibility for her husband's foolishness. Verse 24, that she fell on her feet and said, fell at David's feet and said, Upon thee, my Lord, upon me let this iniquity be, and let thine handmaid, I pray thee, speak in thine audience and hear the words of thine handmaid. Let not my Lord, I pray thee, regard this man of Belial, even Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. But I, thine handmaid, saw not the young men of my Lord, whom you did send. Now, here's a really good thing that Abigail does here. Instead of getting angry at David or trying to deflect blame in any sort of way, Abigail basically is willing to take the brunt of it, right? She puts all the blame on herself when we know that she wasn't worthy to be blamed, right? Upon me, my Lord, upon me let this iniquity be, right? Or your evil thoughts, hold me responsible for that. Now, that's important because what we saw in verse 22 is David had no intention of killing the women, right? He said he had no intention of killing the women that were connected to Nabal. So, naturally, it's a really good thing. Abigail takes on the blame. David's not willing to kill the women. David's going to naturally calm down, perhaps. You note, of course, that Abigail, acknowledges, right, that her household, and she, even though she takes on the blame, she recognizes that David had a right to be angry, right? She notes that this iniquity, this wrongdoing, she wants the blame to be put on her. And you note here that she finds a really good way to gain common ground. If you're trying to make peace between two individuals, and this is the way it works with Bible studies too, in my experience, is that generally you get off to a better start when you try to find common ground with individuals, because you're not automatically going right at each other, right? Because you're trying to see where you have common ground. And it's funny here, this is how Abigail finds common ground, right? Verse 25, the way that they find common ground is Abigail says her husband's a fool, right? David would have agreed with that, obviously, based on how Nabal has treated David. David would have agreed with the idea, Nabal's a worthless or a foolish individual. And you know that Abigail even says that about her own husband. Perhaps if her husband was with her when she brought him, she may not have been that blunt or been that expressive about it. But she finds common ground. They both would have agreed that, again, Nabal, as she says, he's a worthless man. Even Nabal, as his name is, so is he. The word Nabal means foolish. Foolish is his name, folly is with him. And David would certainly agree with that point. And it says a lot about Abigail. It says very poorly about Nabal. Again, Nabal is supposed to be the head of his household, and in cases like that, he's supposed to be the one that handles the dispute. You might want to tie in here, when we read about in the Old Testament another prominent story where a man had a falling out with his brother, and the man, when he heard that his brother was coming, he was going to send in gifts to try to resolve the issue, right, with his brother. You remember who those two characters are? Jacob and Esau, right? Jacob had a falling out. Jacob took the responsibility, right, that I'm going to amend these wrongs and to act as the head of my household. Well, Nabal doesn't do that here, right? Abigail's the one that has to step into it. And that's how she's going to respond, and that's how she responds towards David. Right? Nabal's a fool. We can both agree with that. And you almost could probably picture here David's face being a face of great anger. You could almost picture here that his face is the anger in his face is slowly subsiding away. He's becoming a little bit more calm, perhaps, because of how Abigail handles this situation. Doesn't do anything harsh towards David. She recognizes David's in the right. She finds common ground again, that they both can agree Nabal's a fool. They're not all that different. But now what she does in verses 26 through 31 is basically she gets David to think about what are the long-term ramifications if you decide to go and act on your anger. What is going to be the long-term end result, David, if you go out and you get revenge and you take Nabal's life yourself? And I've got this section from verses 26 through 31. I've got it divided basically into 4 parts. There are four things that Abigail says as a response to this idea, right? What are the long-term consequences for David getting revenge? All right, verse 26, the first one we want to note is that David, if you go and get revenge, God's going to be upset with what you've done. Basically what Abigail says. Verse 26, now therefore, my Lord, as the Lord liveth and as thy soul liveth, seeing the Lord hath withholden thee from coming to shed blood, and from avenging thyself with thine own hand, now let thine enemies and they that seek evil to my Lord be as Nabal. We've talked about this before, but that opening phrase, now therefore my Lord, as the Lord liveth and as thy soul liveth, it was basically trying to show her certainty about what she meant. If we say something to the extent of, I can promise you right now that gas prices are going to rise over the course of the next 24 hours, that I can promise you sort of emphasizes our certainty about it. Hopefully that's not the case, but it could very well be possibly the case. But it shows her certainty, right? And what Abigail pictures herself or tells David here is that she is basically, it connects back to verse 22, right? Because we said in verse 22, David saw himself as the instrument of God to go and get vengeance, right? That's how David saw himself. Right? He's God's servant to go get vengeance against Nabal. But in verse 26, Abigail says that, seeing the Lord hath withholden thee from coming to shed blood, and from avenging thyself with thine own hand. What she's saying here is that the actual instrument of God, if it's a person here, it's me. It's not you, it's me. Because God does not want you to go and to shed blood. The indication when she says shed blood in the Old Testament connects back to the idea of murder. Right? And that's what, if David kills the innocent men there, he would have committed murder. And from avenging thyself with thine own hand. Right? Instead of David being the servant of God in this situation, verse 22, it's really Abigail. Because she's going to keep David from getting revenge. And we're going to know how Abigail's going to benefit David later on. Right? So the picture here is, again, the timing is perfect, verse 20. And at the same time, because she's arrived at the perfect time, she's there to quell David's anger before he unleashes it on Nabal and his servants. Right? You note here, verse 26, again, that Abigail prevented David from avenging thyself with whose hand? Yeah, Abigail says to David again, from avenging thyself with thine own hand, David's own hand. The point being here is that it would be because of David's wants that Nabal is killed at the hand of David. That's what she's saying here, right? Avenging thyself not with God's hand, but with your own hand, or because of your own intent. And she points out this is not what God wants, because the timings work perfectly. God's providence has worked perfectly where I have arrived to stop you from committing murder. So, likewise, into verse 26, the enemies that you have, let them be as Nabal. Right? They're not worth the time and the effort to get personal in retribution. Think about the long-term consequences. You think about that on a personal level just for a moment. We have a tendency to want to get retribution whenever somebody does us wrong, and maybe we act on that. And maybe we get that immediate satisfaction of getting retribution, but perhaps somebody else looks at that and maybe doesn't even have a full picture of the story. But yet they formulate an opinion about us that we're not a very merciful, we're not very kind towards other individuals. Even though we might have been in the right. That immediate need to get retribution, sometimes it doesn't always, it has long-term consequences. Now note verse 27, another thing that Abigail points out here, right? Not just that you're going to make God angry, but if you get immediate retribution, you could very well lose what you initially wanted, right? Verse 27, now this blessing, referring to verse 18, all the gifts that Abigail brought to David, all these things which your handmaid has brought to you, my Lord, let it even be given unto the young men that follow my Lord. Right? David, remember what you initially wanted. You just wanted provisions. You wanted food and water and things like that for your men. But if you think about it, if David goes and attacks Nabal and his men, and there's a pretty big battle there, could be that all those supplies David's men needed could have been destroyed in the process of that, right? That's often what happens in times of battle. You remember it back in chapter 14, right? That Saul was told that Saul as a leader was trying to get his men to completely wipe out the Philistines, so much so that he made an oath that they could not eat that day, and it wearied his men. Saul jeopardized his men in that situation because of his own personal vendetta against the Philistines. Same thing could very well happen to David here. Abigail saying, if you go and you attack Nabal, if you destroy all those goods your men need, you're going to jeopardize the well-being of your men. So think about that long-term issue. Now, verses 28 through 29, a third point we could pull out here is that Abigail would tell David, if you get immediate revenge, you're not going to allow God to work in his time. Verse 28, I pray thee, forgive the trespass of thine handmaid, for the Lord will certainly make my Lord a sure house, because my Lord fighteth the battles of the Lord. And evil hath not been found in thee all thy days. Yet a man is risen to pursue thee, and to seek thy soul, but the soul of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of life with the Lord thy God, and the souls of thine enemies, them shall he sling out, as out of the middle of a sling. Now you know verse 28, what Abigail says here, right? One thing you want to keep in mind is that you see the word Lord is used 4 times in that verse, but there are 2 different spellings because you've got 2 individuals being talked about. Again, where you see Lord with a capital L and then the smaller capital O-R-D, it's a reference to God. The lowercase Lord there is a reference to David. And this is amazing what Abigail says here in this verse, right? The Lord will certainly make my Lord a sure house, because my Lord fighteth the battles of the Lord. Or God will certainly make my Lord David a sure house, because David fighteth the battles of God. And the point that she's making here is that since chapter 17, most in Israel have recognized, and we recognize this too, that David has consistently fought battles for God. Right? He fought against Goliath, and Goliath had dishonored the name of God by, making light of the children of Israel by calling on his own gods. You know, David began defending God's honor there, and we've noted before these military successes that David had showed that he was fighting battles for God as God's servant. And so what she simply says here to David is, you fought battles for God. How about let God fighting some of your battles for you? Right? God will certainly make my Lord a sure house. And we've seen that before, right? Where God's providence has preserved David. And that's what she's pointing out here. You know, you fought battles for God. Accept God's gift that he will fight some of your battles for you. Just as, Abigail wants David to accept this gift that she's giving to him. So Abigail notes again the surety of the promises of God. We'll say this verse for the end, but verse 29, again, she points out the fact that, since David, as we've seen, is that God is with him, David doesn't have anything to worry about. Again, the imagery there used, the end of verse 29, whereas David is in the bundle of life, he is in, he is right with God. You note how she characterizes the enemies of David, right? Verse 29, them shall he sling out as out of the middle of a sling. And no doubt she knew about the story of David and Goliath, right? Because that story was well known throughout Israel. And her point being is, just as it's sure that you're going to have a kingdom, just as it's sure that you are right with God, there's also a certainty that God's going to take your enemies and like a rock in a slingshot, he's going to put them in a slingshot and throw them away. Right? It's the idea there. So that the final point, Abigail says, not only if you get immediate retribution, David, not only are you going to make God angry, not only are you going to possibly hurt your men, not only are you not going to allow God's providence to work, but you could very well jeopardize your own kingdom. Verses 30 through 31, we'll close with these 2 verses. And it shall come to pass, when the Lord shall have done to my Lord according to all the good that he hath spoken concerning thee, and shall have appointed thee ruler over Israel. And this is the important part, verse 31. Once David becomes king, that this shall be no grief unto thee, nor offense of heart unto my Lord, either that thou hast shed blood causeless, or that my Lord hath avenged himself. But when God shall have dealt well with my Lord, then remember thine handmaid. And her point is that later on, when David became king, David would not have to worry about the consequences of committing this sin while he was a king. He would not have to worry about living with the fact that even though he's king of Israel, that like Saul, he took innocent Israelite lives because of his own retribution. And that's what she says there. Verse 31 again, David, you're not going to have to worry about that. And likewise, you're going to have the loyalty of the people. And we'll talk more about that next week, but that's her main point, verses 26 through 31, right? You want to get revenge, which sounds great now, but think about the long-term consequences of doing that. What's that going to have an effect, not just on you, but on those around you? And that's where we'll draw to a close tonight as we think about, the need for peacemakers in society. It's easy for us to get what we want immediately, but part of the need for peacemakers is that generally they see the bigger picture, right? They see the bigger picture, and that's what Abigail understood. Just as the Jews and the Romans didn't like each other in Jesus' day, Jesus saw the bigger picture, right? The problem wasn't the Jews or the Romans, the problem was the problem of sin. And Jesus was a perfect peacemaker because he eliminated the most prevalent problem that's known to man. And so that's something for us to think about tonight. Are there any comments or anything that you'd like to add on to what we've discussed?
You got to give Abigail credit. She was a brave woman standing against her husband. A lot of these skirmishes and fights that we have, we get defensive when somebody, says our family's wrong, or my family can never be wrong. But she knew her family was wrong.
Yeah.
And stood up for the right, even against her own family.
And keep in mind, she basically stood up against an army, right? I mean, this is an army that's come to do battle against Nabal. And again, that shows a lot of courage on the part of Abigail. But we'll pick up next week in verse 32, noting how David's going to thank Abigail for helping him see the full picture here. But we'll stop here tonight.